I'm going to talk now about the question of could, not should, could the British have won the American War of Independence? And I mention not should because I want to reassure American listeners that there is no sense of sadness or regret in Britain that we lost the war. We've had a very harmonious relationship, sometimes closer, sometimes less close, but with America since 1815. And the British have had so many other disasters in their history, they don't need to go back to the 18th century to find their regrets. So it's really could. And the point about could is that it's not just interesting in its own sense, it also gives one an idea about how military matters work out, because generally when war happens, both sides think they can win, and invariably at least one, sometimes both are wrong, but also because in a way what I'm going to be saying is much more positive about the Americans than the usual American myth. Because the usual American myth, as my colleague Andrew O'Shaughnessy brilliantly showed, is one in which the British appear, as he termed it, as buffoons. And what I want to show is that this is not the case, that in many senses Britain was a potent power, and that therefore it was an enormous achievement to have defeated the British. And the last point I want to make, and this is also true whenever one's talking about war, which it's terribly easy to do sort of with glib assurance, is real people risked their lives, real people lost their lives, real people were wounded. One, in a sense, when one's talking about this, one's always aware about it. Also, we owe people in the past to have more than a sentimental response to the past, but to be engaged with the problems they faced and to try and use our understanding to both appreciate what they did, but also to understand it. So let me start rather bringing on from where Andrew was with the standard image. And the standard image has a sun-kissed meadow. And in that sun-kissed meadow, lines of redcoats are moving forward with the sun reflected off the steel of their bayonets. Meanwhile, on the other side of the field, brave patriots, clad in brown or green, it would be wrong if they were kneeling, let's say crouching or sheltering behind stone walls or trees, and they're about to blast these idiots to pieces. And that visual image epitomizes the way in which the war tends to be understood. It tends to be understood as a struggle between anachronism in the case of the British and modernity in the case of the Patriots. It tends to be understood as inevitable, and it tends to be seen as it were, something in which the military flows into the political and the political to the military. In other words, imperial rule is anachronistic and therefore bound to fail. The British Ancien regime military system is anachronistic, therefore bound to fail. Each of them supply in part the reason for the anachronism of the other. Now, what I want to try and do is to argue to you that that is misleading, that Britain had many strengths, that the Patriots faced many difficulties, and that therefore the achievement of beating the British was a major success. And in doing so, I want to throw light both on American history, but also on British history and the British Empire. So my time is limited. Let us start with strengths the British had. This is not an exhaustive list. I could go on, but I just want to illustrate the strengths. And I want to do that first in the bigger context and then in the more specifics of fighting. Bigger context. Britain in 1775 had the largest fleet in the world. Andrew Lambert is going to talk about the naval dimension. And of course, both the French and the Spaniards had been building warships, but France and Spain weren't involved in the war till 1778. So the British had a very significant, well-led, navy which was well used to operating on the other side of the Atlantic and which had harbours accordingly and an administrative structure accordingly, and their opponents didn't have any of that. And crucially in that respect, the three major British naval bases in the New World, Halifax, Nova Scotia, English Harbour, Antigua, and in Kingston, Jamaica, none of them were areas that rebelled. If the three major British naval bases had all been in the 13 colonies where had been seized by the Patriots, the situation, at least initially navally, would have been very, very different. Secondly, Britain had enormous experience as an expeditionary power. The British military essentially had two main military roles outside the country. Suppressing internal rebellion had been a role, but outside the country it had two main roles since the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89, operating on the European continent, as it had done in each of the wars, but also operating abroad, operating in North America, operating in the Caribbean in particular. And from that perspective, operating in the 13 colonies was neither unusual nor particularly difficult, because whereas operating, for example, in the 1760 campaign in which they advanced on Montreal from three directions, that was a considerable difficulty in operating inside the interior of America, albeit helped by river routes. There was a completely different case with reference to North America, the eastern seaboard of North America, because the eastern seaboard of North America is interdicted by large bodies of water. Very contrast with the western seaboard. The eastern seaboard, the major things are, of course, Long Island Sound, they are the Chesapeake, they are the Delaware, and they are, for that matter, the St. Lawrence insofar as helping to counterattack against the Patriot invasion force of Canada, into Canada. So all of those helps with the Navy. On top of that, there are large rivers which are passable by warships. Warships could navigate up the Hudson with quite considerable ease. Warships could get to Philadelphia, which was a port. All the major cities on the eastern seaboard are ports. All of them are accessible. And of course, there is no countervailing system of land transport. It is much quicker to move by sea than it is by land. And this is particularly the case because obviously one of the great glories of travelling in modern America, which is, the bridges that have been built, well, they weren't there then. And you need ferries to cross, and to move a significant force across by ferry is not easy. So, in communication terms and in power projection terms, the Brits have it. On top of that, in terms of the contexts, one has to look at domestic politics and finance. The government had just won the 1774 general election. It had won it well. Under the Septennial Act, which was then in force, it was only obliged to have another general election 7 years later or on the death of a monarch. In fact, as was perfectly legal, it had happened in 1747, they chose to go for an election earlier. They had an election again in 1780, and again the government won it. So right the way through until the aftermath of Yorktown, the government is in control of the domestic political circumstances in a way, for example, that had been very different in the 7 Years' War, when the government had actually fallen in 1756 and there'd been political chaos from 56 to 57, or different to the War of the Austrian Succession, when, as Andrew was mentioning, the government had fallen in 1742, another government fell in 1744, another government fell in 1746, and the same with the War of the Spanish Succession. Britain was unusually politically stable. I don't mean by that everybody supported the war. That's not the case. I don't mean by that there weren't pressures for political reform. There were, particularly in 1780. But in terms of the ability to go on getting government business through the House of Commons, they were actually doing very well. And again, it was to be different, for example, in the Napoleonic War, and for that matter, the ministry, although it had its uneasinesses and its divisions, which it definitely had, and Andrew mentioned those in the case of Lord North, there was no equivalent in the American war until towards the end, with the chaos of British high politics in 1915 and 1916 as Asquith was chipped away, or indeed 1940 when Chamberlain was pushed out. So that is an important element, and indeed the British government was one of the most stable in Europe at that moment. On top of that, the public finances. Britain was in debt. That was, after all, one of the bases of the chaos and the problems that had underlay determination to try and rectify the situation after the 7 Years' War. But the British national debt was the best bet in Europe. Indeed, during the war with France and with the Dutch, which went on, as you know, the Dutch came in on the French side in 1780, the Dutch, although allied with the French, preferred to put their money into British national debt, which they regarded as safer, and the government went on being able to raise its money throughout the war. Whereas in the French Revolutionary War, Britain had to come off the gold standard and had to introduce income tax, there was no need to resort to either of those expedients during the American War. And this is important because it meant that they could sustain the struggle. This was not going to be a one-campaign war or a two-campaign war or a three-campaign war. And it also links to what is a fundamental strategic asymmetry about this war. You know, in wars you can have a strategic symmetry or a strategic asymmetry. There's an asymmetry here. The Americans, the Patriots, cannot stop the British launching expeditionary forces against North America. Obviously, as I understand, Andrew Lambert is going to be discussing with you the implications of French entry. I'm talking here about prior to French entry. But there is absolutely nothing they can do. They can send warships into British waters. John Paul Jones goes off to, Flamborough Head and takes part in operations on the coast of Ireland. But essentially, America is not a strategic threat to Britain. The war is not going to end with Patriot troops landing, as William III had done at Brixham, and then fighting their way or advancing via Salisbury on London. It's not going to end, as Charles Edward Stuart tried to have it end in 1745, with troops moving down and capturing Carlisle and then Manchester and Derby and aiming for London. There's simply not going to happen like that. So that, in a way, the British home base is safe. The British cannot be knocked out of the war by the Patriots. For example, in 1779, there's a Franco-Spanish invasion attempt on Britain. It proves abortive. 1744, 1759, 1708, 1692, there'd been French invasion attempts, and there were to be more during the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. There is nothing that the Patriots can do that is equivalent. And that strategic asymmetry is very important to British opportunities and capabilities and to the limitations facing the Patriots. What other points are worth mentioning? Well, other points that are worth mentioning is, of course, this is, as I discussed in the previous one, a civil war within the empire. And there's a very good book by Andrew O'Shaughnessy on the British West Indies during the American Revolution. And the point is that although there had been disaffection there about the Stamp Act, and there were one or two other issues, the West Indies do not rebel. In the case of the North American colonies, in the case of the Canadian ones, there was a limited, very limited support for the Patriots when they moved north in 75. But it's very limited and isn't sustained. And essentially, those are safe colonies from the English, from the British point of view, as long as they can hold off the Patriots. There is no rising in Ireland. There is no rising or revived disaffection in Scotland. As it were, the colonial system, the major problem for the British, in fact, and it becomes a significant problem in the early 1780s, is India that's causing them difficulties. They have a short war against the Maharathas that doesn't work well in the late 1770s, and a more serious and sustained war against Hyder Ali and then his son, Tipu Sultan of Mysore, between 1780 and 84. And the French send a small expeditionary force. And that does put strain on the British. But nevertheless, the empire holds there, And I think it's fair to say that particularly when the Americans are fighting, or the Patriots are fighting on their own, they are really suffering from that point of view. And it's worth bearing in mind that that gives the 75, 76, 77 and first half of the 78 campaigning seasons to the British to try and, as it were, inflict their will in North America. And that is a considerable margin of opportunity. And whereas, for example, in 1747, the British had considered sending and 1746 actually before that, the British had considered sending an expeditionary force to attack French Canada, and instead the troops had to be used in Europe. There was no equivalent in 75, 76, 77, 78. So these are all important factors. There are others we can go on for, but let's also now look at politics within America, or North America. Another aspect helping Britain is that within the 13 colonies themselves, this is a civil war as well. Now, historians are divided as to either the value of trying to think of giving percentages to the respective combatants or what those percentages should be. I mean, among the ones bandied around are a third patriot, a third loyalist, a third not wanting to commit themselves, a fifth patriot, a fifth loyalist, 3/5 not wanting to commit themselves. Different ratios have been argued. What is clear is that the loyalists existed, that they were a military force, and that they were a military option. They are also more significant because, like the Patriots, they are more concentrated in particular areas. In New England and Virginia, you have heavy concentrations of Patriots. In Georgia, North Carolina, New York, eastern shore of the Chesapeake, you have major concentrations of loyalists, and that creates opportunities. Now, we can debate the question as to whether the British should have made more use of the loyalists. We can debate whether they exaggerated what the loyalists their potential that might exist. Those can both be discussed, but the key point is they are there and they're willing to fight and they are willing to die. People like Patrick Ferguson's men at King's Mountain, take very heavy casualty rates. So that's an important point. Insofar as Native Americans or African Americans are concerned, I think it's fair to say that most African Americans, the majority of them, of course, are slaves. They're not in a position to take part. But where slaves tend to engage or have the opportunity of engaging, they tend to be willing to fight for the British if they're given their liberty. And that's used, for example, by the last royal governor of Virginia. It's used in Georgia. It's a factor. As far as Native Americans are concerned, they have their own agendas. And some of the tribes seek not to be engaged, but other tribes are engaged, particularly the Iroquois, and they are a major diversion of continental military force, particularly in 1779, and the Patriots, Continental Army, are not able to knock them out, nor are they able, despite plans, to seize the bases the British used to supply them, particularly Detroit. So that's a factor. I think if one's looking at the fighting nature of the war, it's also important. Now, I mentioned at the very outset the idea that it's wrong to see the Patriots as in some way bound to win, or indeed a revolutionary force. And one thing that might surprise you is that this is, in many senses, and one has to always use these terms with care, but a very conservative war. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, in terms of weaponry, it is not a war of new departures. There's one major weapon that is tried out briefly. Anybody know what it is? No. The submarine. Okay, the submarine. It's the first. There'd been prototypes of submarines before. It's the first workable one, but it's essentially a corked wooden barrel powered by somebody's, with an individual in it, powered by the equivalent of a bicycle mechanism, turning up, moving a foot up and down and turning a screw at the back, and armed with the equivalent of a giant corkscrew holding an explosive charge. And, And look, if it had worked, it would have made an enormous difference because they're undefended roadsteads, but it didn't. I mean, it worked in the sense that it moved, but it didn't work in the sense of being able to change the situation. The Americans are to go on being important. Robert Fulton, in the 1800s and 18-teens, of course, with torpedoes, with submarines, with eventually steamships, tries things out. But, they don't make any significant difference at all in those wars, and certainly they don't in the American War of Independence. Other than that, it's actually same old weapons. And they're ones the British are used to. Sometimes you get American commentators saying, oh, well, surely the Americans were going to win because they had the rifles. Actually, rifles in that period were not particularly useful. They're good as a sniping tool, very good as a sniping tool. I mean, probably American listeners don't need me to explain what a rifle is, but British listeners possibly do. A rifle has got rifling on the inside of the barrel, which guides the projectile down it and means that the projectile will leave the barrel at a higher velocity and therefore with more force than if it's a smoothbore. That's essentially it. And that's, you might say, jolly useful. Well, and it is useful if you're sniping and, of course, if you're an expert. But the practicality is that precisely because it is a snugger fit, it takes longer to reload. Generally agreed that it's one rifle shot you could get out a minute. It's generally agreed that flintlock muskets are either 2 or 3 shots a minute, and the British regular infantry who were trained had good fire discipline, just as incidentally then the naval gunnery was good. So again, good fire discipline and a good rate of fire. And the last point that's very significant is that rifles, because they're a more precise tool, you don't tend to put a bayonet on them, because putting a steel sleeve on the end of a rifle damages the barrel and the rifling, which means riflers classically were in a very dangerous position up against advancing musketeers. And you get patriot commanders like Anthony Wayne, the commander of the Pennsylvania line in the Continental Army, demanding that the rifles in his units be handed in so that they could be replaced by muskets carrying bayonets. So in terms of firepower, no real difficulty nor difference. The British, of course, had riflemen of their own, particularly Hessian Jaegers, Hessians trained in hunting, to do their own skirmishing. There's not other than that, much difference between them. And I think that's important because the standard image would suggest otherwise. But the British are pretty good. And of course, the British are used to counterinsurgency warfare. They have 4 major counterinsurgency struggles in the 18th century. Against the Jacobites in Scotland and Northern England, 1715 to 16, against the Jacobites in Scotland and Northern England, 1745 to 6, against the American Patriots, 1775 to 1783, and in Ireland in 1798. And they win 3 out of 4. It is a conceit of those who often look at warfare who are, shall we say, politically engaged, to imagine that what they call people's warfare is bound to prevail over professionalism and regulars. This is rubbish. It's rubbish in the post-1945 world. There were instances in which insurgencies failed, Greek communists, for example, or the Filipino communists in the 1940s and 50s, or for that matter, the anti-Soviet nationalists in the Baltic republics in the late 40s. There are sometimes insurgencies succeed. Sometimes communists in Malaya, for example, or the Mau Mau, they fail. And one needs to understand that in terms of the specificities of an individual conflict, rather than assuming emotionally or intellectually that one form or method of warfare is bound to prevail. And that is a misleading one. And it's not been helped by the extent to which a number of good American commentators, I'm thinking in particular of John Shire, a very nice man as well, were misled into thinking that there was a comparison between the Vietnam War and the American Revolutionary War, which is absurd in terms of both political context and in terms of the nature of fighting. Now, what other points do I think it's germane to make? Well, if you're thinking about British strengths, you can also then look at some of the Patriot weaknesses. And these are obviously in part just a mirror image. So, strength of the British Navy, relative weakness of the American Navy as an operational force as opposed to as individual warships that might fight individual battles. But, the American Navy isn't, for example, capable of achieving or even trying to achieve the operational or strategic task of closing or challenging the opening of the St. Lawrence to prevent British ships resupplying or reinforcing British Canada. They can't do that in the War of 1812 either, and I don't think they'd have been able to do it in the Civil War either if the British had intervened. So, that's an instance. But there are also more specific problems. A revolution that begins in part, and I'm not minimizing it, but it begins in part as an anti-authoritarian rising directed in particular against tax demands, is not the best basis for then putting in power a government which is going to, as it were, squeeze resources out of that society in order to support a major military force. And indeed, that doesn't happen. There are major problems of funding. If you look at the Revolutionary War correspondence of George Washington, which has been published in an excellent edition by the University of Virginia Press, you will find that Washington is endlessly complaining about a shortage of resources. And in all respects, in munitions, in manpower, in money, in food. And then other things like wagons, for example. He's always complaining, and he's right to complain because, in a way, the politicians have willed a political outcome which involves war without considering how they're going to be able to support this war. And of course, they're doing so against a background of growing strain. It's generally agreed that the campaign in which most Americans volunteered for the Patriot cause is which one, anybody? Well, the first, 1775. And enthusiasm subsequently declines. Fewer Americans come forward. There are more problems getting them motivated and sustained. And of course, by the beginning of 1781, you have rebellions in the Pennsylvania and New Jersey line. The troops are angry about not being paid and not being supplied, and they're fed up. And everybody else, the British, the French, are well aware of these growing problems in the Continental Army. And I think that element needs to be borne in mind because there tends to be a triumphalism, a kind of account which says, yes, we had problems and we had to get a bit cold at Valley Forge, but once we'd got our sort of act together and had got trained, we were as good as them and we were going to win. Well, actually, the army was the main field army was in grave difficulties. And high rates of desertion, of course, much higher rates of desertion in the Patriot units than in terms of British regulars by far. And of course, one of the major problems of desertion is the troops tended to go home taking their weapons with them. Then on top of that, there are the major problems in relationships between, and linked to this, of course, between, as it were, the institutions of the new national level, of which the Continental Army is the major instance, and the Continental Congress, and the individual provinces, colonies, which have now become, as it were, proto-states, which have their own armed forces, their own militia, and which they are not necessarily willing to use at the behest of the Continental Congress or put them under the Continental Army. Same thing in the War of 1812, incidentally. The New England states proved very unwilling to allow troops to move. They were happy to have the troops, their own troops, defend their own states, but not to have them move into Canada. So exactly the same. And indeed, I think it's fair to say that the commitment of the New England colonist states to the war in the South was rather limited. I think that's being polite, and it certainly led to complaint and anxiety. So there's those problems. And then, of course, there's also the problems caused, as indeed the same for the Confederacy in the Civil War, by a measure of economic exhaustion. The 13 colonies make their money in many respects by exporting product to European markets, things like rice from Georgia, timber from North Carolina, tobacco from the Chesapeake, and so on. And of course, those markets are very much affected by British naval action, same again as the War of 1812. And there are liquidity crises, very serious liquidity crises, really big build-up to a major one by 1780. And on top of that, the actual economies of the individual states are in difficulties. It's an excellent book by the American scholar Harold Selensky on the war in Connecticut, which was largely the breadbasket state for the Continentals in the Middle Colonies. Not much fighting there, some coastal raids, but the key thing that he's bringing out in his book is that the process of expropriation or, as it were, forcible contribution means that the state's economy is running out of things like wagons, horses, draft animals, seed corn, that the economy is getting more and more troubled and in difficulties. So the Patriots have problems, and then on top of that, it's very much unclear to them what strategy they should try and follow and what operational method. I mean, in crude terms, two are offered. This is crude, but this, I think, does work. One we associate quite rightly with George Washington, and the other one with Major General Charles Lee, who's one of his more senior officers, or I should say one of the more senior officers of the Continental Army, and more militarily experienced than Washington. Lee argues that the great problem is the professional skill of the British Army, and that the way to deal with that is to avoid field engagements. He argues that the Patriots should, in a sense, resort to guerrilla warfare. He's thinking about the model of how the Poles responded to Russian invasion at the end of the 1760s, beginning of the 1770s. He'd been there. And he argues that they should then attack isolated British positions, British supply lines, but avoid main battle engagement and avoid position warfare. In other words, holding a position where you can then be attacked. That argument is rejected by Washington, essentially for political reasons, though there's also the argument that you have to keep the Continental Army together and not that if you go to small units, what they will do is desert. And Washington argues that as it were, the strength and safety for the revolution depends upon winning international recognition, that otherwise they'll be seen as a group of bandits, and that the only way to do that is to have a regular army and to operate in a regular fashion, and that they need to maintain domestic confidence and foreign confidence or interest by holding on to key positions, which means, of course, that in 1776, he thinks it's important to fight for New York, which of course leads to disaster at the Battle of Long Island and then at the surrender at the fort at the northern end, I think it's Fort Washington at the northern end of Manhattan Island. In 1777, it's important to fight for the defense of Philadelphia, and that leads to disaster at Brandywine. And in 1780, though he isn't the one making the germane decision, it's important to fight for the defence of Charleston, although that leads to the surrender of the largest force of American patriots to surrender in the war. I think I'm correct in saying, I'd be very happy to be corrected here, that the number of people surrendering at Charleston are far larger than the number of Brits surrendering at Yorktown the following year in 1781. It's rather interesting as to what gets paid attention to. So, in other words, Washington has a political military strategy which, in a sense, plays into the British hands. And there's an analogue here, you might argue, into the Civil War, because for the Civil War, there is no way that the North can conquer all of the South. But of course, what it wishes to do is to knock out the South's will, and to do that by seizing key positions. New Orleans early in the war, Richmond, many attempts, the Confederate capital, and to inflict defeat. And correspondingly, the Confederates have essentially a political military strategy. Their objective is, by marching north, as they do in 1862 to Antietam and 1863 to Gettysburg, to convince international opinion and domestic opinion in the North that it can't win, and that the election cycle in the North, the 62 midterms, the 64 presidential, will hopefully lead to a victory for the anti-war forces, the Democrats, and the fall of the Republicans, and that this will actually mean that a peace deal is done. And, you know, you can debate the rights or wrongs of it. You can read my new book on the Civil War. But what I think is the case is that you can't understand the strategy unless you're willing to understand and appreciate that there was a political context and point to it. And the same is germane for the War of Independence. So let's put those two together, British strengths and patriot weaknesses, and ask the question, well, could the British have won? Well, the first point, which is an obvious one, is, well, what do you mean by winning? I mean, that's a very obvious point here. And of course, what you might argue were the war goals that you might have varied. In other words, the British in 1779, by the Carlisle Commission, offered very different terms to what they'd been willing to offer at the outset. And, you know, if you construe that as winning, fine. You know, or alternatively, you might have argued that would have just set you up for more troubles post-war. It's unclear. And I think it's worth commenting. I spoke at a conference in the United States in February, which had a whole series of heavy American hitters. I was the only foreigner there. And the Carlisle Commission and the possibility of peace in 1779 was a major topic in paper after paper, which were ostensibly on other subjects, but it came to the fore. In other words, we know what is going to happen. We know that in the aftermath of Yorktown, the British government is going to fall, and we know that the new political dispensation in Britain leads to a decision to try and end the war in North America, and in order to focus resources on conflicts with France and Spain. And we know that the British are to succeed in peeling apart their opponents so that the post-war is actually less grim than it might have been. We also know earlier that, of course, the French and the Spaniards are going to go in. Well, let me tell you, that is by no means clear at the time. I don't just mean the benefit of hindsight. If you look at, if you go to the Archives étrangères, the French Foreign Ministry archives, you can read the debates on the French Council in 1778. Now, there's obviously a logic that you can explain as to why France went into the war. But actually in 1778, something much more important was going on. There was a war breaking out in Europe. Anybody know which the war was? No, you don't, because people working on American history never do. The War of the Bavarian Succession. France's major European ally, Austria, was going to war with Prussia. The Austrians, required and sought the assistance of their ally, France, and the French government debated, do we send our forces to the support of Austria? And the British government was very hopeful that the French would get involved there, or do we choose to fight the Brits in North America? And there was absolutely no inevitability. French government is divided. There is a separate division between the principal finance minister and the foreign minister as to whether actually France can afford any war at all at that point, because France has had the failure, not just the heavy cost of the 7 Years' War, but it is also by failing to push through the Maupu Revolution. Its fiscal system is very, very limited, and it's not producing vast quantities of taxation. So it's by no means clear that the French are going to come in. And, one way of playing through the counterfactual is asking, well, what would have happened if the French hadn't come into the war? And probably there'd have been a compromise peace. What the form of the compromise peace would have been, I don't know, because there are two types of compromise that are possible. There is the compromise that is eventually arrived at, and as you will be aware, 1783 is a compromise peace. The British North America is split. The Patriots gain the 13 colonies and they gain the Old Northwest, although of course the British don't pull out of it till the 1790s. But they don't gain Canada, and for that matter, they don't gain Florida. East and West Florida, the two colonies of that period, are both transferred to Spain. So there's that form of compromise, and you could ask whether it would have been possibly a different geographical compromise might have been arrived at earlier. The other form of compromise is, of course, a different nature of fiscal or governmental arrangement, such as indeed several of the founding fathers had suggested in 1776, because not all the founding fathers wanted a full break with Britain. So in effect, full-scale autonomy, but with foreign policy and probably defence policy under the auspices of the British Crown. In other words, a form of dominion status 100 years earlier. Now, there are several ways you can look at that. Well, I say 100 years earlier. In fact, if you think of responsible government in Canada, so-called responsible government, they're already doing that by the 1840s. Now, there are several ways you can look at that. You can say, well, Jeremy, what you're doing is you're envisaging something that wasn't really yet within the language of contemporaries in terms of dominion status. That is true, but it doesn't mean it was without their conception. And in fact, some of the correspondence of the founding fathers in 75 and 76 is envisaging exactly what I'm talking about. So one of the questions is it the case that the British government remains, and here, and I agree with Andrew O'Shaughnessy, one's thinking more specifically of George III, although he did have ministers like Lord Chancellor Thurlow who were of the same mind as him. But is it the case that George III is too rigid on this, just as he's going to subsequently be too rigid against Catholic emancipation? As you may know, he has opposed Catholic emancipation. That leads to the fall of the Younger Pitt Ministry in 1801 and the fall of the Ministry of All Talents in 1807. But Catholic emancipation is there after his death by the end of the 1820s. So is it and also it is fully within people's understanding as something that could be thought about and should be thought about and is important in terms of the governance of Ireland and in particular the active union with Ireland. So in other words, is there something that would be possible earlier? Yes, quite clearly. Would it have worked? I don't know. I think what's fair to say, flipping back to what we were talking about earlier, is there are some areas which were more prone to think about returning to what the British conceived of as their obedience than others. I mean, Charleston, South Carolina is a good example to think about. Now, as you will know, the background sometimes that is mentioned is that the revolution was won in men's hearts and minds before, etc., etc. You know the quote. There is also the argument Benjamin Franklin made. We will never make peace with these people, the Brits, because they have made war upon us and they've done nasty things. Well, you saw that in Charleston, 1780. Let's be clear, an unsuccessful, largely because of storm, British Expeditionary Force had been sent against Charleston in 76. In 79, Brigadier General Prevost had marched overland from Savannah with a tiny force and had pulled back. So there had been 2 earlier attempts. But in 1780, Clinton goes south, and with a brilliant use of amphibious operations crossing all the rivers nearby, so Army-Navy cooperation working very well, he besieges Charleston. And everybody there is absolutely clear. They are not going to surrender. They're going to fight, and the British can sort of wither outside in the heat. Well, the British open up with red-hot shot at the swine, and Charleston surrendered within a day. And over 5,000 troops have surrendered. And then, of course, the principal figures in Charleston society all take oaths of allegiance to George III. So they publicly disavow their support for independence and the revolution, and they say they'll come back into their obedience. Now, is that possibly as a long term? And that, in a sense, was the British Southern strategy writ large, winning loyalist support or creating loyalist support in the South and then moving up northwards and seeing what happened, whether that led to more serious negotiations. Well, there's 2 ways of looking at it, and Andrew showed the Patriot, and the implication in the Patriot and the discussion of people like Marion and Sumter and the American light cavalry and light infantry in the South is that the British hadn't got a hope. And people have quoted what are known as the Cornwallis or headquarters papers, which are in PRO 30 in the National Archives. And this is correspondence between Cornwallis and Clinton. Clinton goes back to New York, where he's commander-in-chief. After the fall of Charleston, Cornwallis is left in control of the South. The 2 men hate each other. It's perfectly normal in the military, but they hate each other. Cornwallis is keen to blame Clinton for everything that's going wrong. So he writes back, and there's a sort of endless dirge. I haven't got enough troops, I haven't got enough supplies, I haven't got enough weapons, the natives are all hostile, they kill my couriers, they won't sell me supplies, I can't be expected to do anything, send help or don't blame me. All right? British bound to lose. Those papers have been quoted by all number of historians. Well, if you go to the Library of Congress, the manuscript division, or that's where I looked at them, they've subsequently been published by the University of North Carolina, the papers of General Nathaniel Greene. Nathaniel Greene had been sent down to command in the South after Benjamin Lincoln had messed it up at Charleston and Horatio Gates had messed it up at Camden. So there'd been 2 horrific debacles in the South. Nathaniel Greene, somebody Washington trusts, so his personal relations with him are much, much, much better than those between Clinton and Cornwallis. And what does he write back and say? The natives are all hostile. I'm short of men, I'm short of supplies, I'm short of guns, my couriers are being killed by loyalists. I really can't do very much. Send help. And in a way, that shouldn't surprise us. Now, first of all, there are very few, I can tell you this as a military historian, very few generals, I mean, generals are usually alpha males, but very few of them feel they can so guarantee success that they can afford to say they don't want more. I mean, you get one or two generals who are really over the top in this respect. Douglas MacArthur is over the top in his self-esteem, but most generals would like a bit more help, you know. But nevertheless, accepting that, there is this very clear similarity between the two sides. And in a way, it captures the way the war is going by late 80, the beginning of 81. Neither side has won. The Patriots have lost in the middle colonies. They're in no position to challenge the British control of New York and the surrounding area. They've lost in Canada, despite the attempts and the thought of mounting a second offensive there. That's just not going to happen, and the French have made it quite clear they're not interested. They've done badly as far as holding the major positions in the south are concerned. The two major cities in the south are Charleston and Savannah. There isn't a comparable city in North Carolina. The British captured both of those, Savannah in 78, Charleston in 80. The Patriots, by late 80, beginning of 81, are aware that the French are thinking of, first of all, they're angry with the French not providing them with more assistance. The French had provided significant assistance in 79 in an unsuccessful attempt to regain Savannah. There is no comparable assistance on that scale in 1780. And they're aware that the French are more and more interested in, first of all, Caribbean gains, but more specifically in getting out of the war. French war weariness is growing. There's two good biographies of the French Foreign Minister, Vergennes, who in a sense was directing French policy, and Vergennes was getting more worried, not about North America, he's more worried about Russian expansionism in Eastern Europe, the background to the Russian seizure of Crimea in 1783, and he's wanting to disengage. And both the British and the Patriots have picked this up. Well, the French aren't secret about it, you know. So the war appears to be going badly for the Patriots. It's going badly for the British. There is no way in early 81 in envisaging how the British are going to, as it were, change opinion in New England. There are, as you may know, campaigns, raids into Virginia in 81, and in the end, of course, Cornwallis arrives. But I think it's fair to say that the early raids are no more effective than those of the British in the Chesapeake in 1813, the year before the attack on Washington. So I think what I would say is both sides are under strain. The Continental Army is in a mess, which is why there are the mutinies in early 81. And it's quite clear that the Continental Army is not strong enough to take New York. It's still not strong enough in 82. I mean, let's be clear about this. The Yorktown is very significant, but it doesn't lead to the surrender of British positions in New York, Savannah or Charleston, nor is it the surrender of the main British army in North America, something that people tend to forget. The main army is in New York. So in a way, everything appears to be up for grabs. And in that context, I think the problem is that both sides take increasingly risky options. Both sides can feel the war drifting away from them. Both sides can feel there are problems. For the British, although, as Andrew Lambert is going to be discussing, there is this tremendous and excellent naval victory at the Saints in 82, as yet it hasn't happened. So for the British, there are anxieties about the naval situation, which are certainly not eased when the Dutch also come in 1780 on the other side. And for the Patriots and the French, there is a sense that this is all getting out of control. And that leads to what I think one could fairly say were the multiple risks of the the operations of 81, which we focus on in terms of Yorktown. Now, what Cornwallis did himself was no more dangerous than what Clinton had done in 78. Clinton had retreated from Philadelphia, fought a battle at Monmouth Courthouse, which was a draw, retreated to the New Jersey shore in a very exposed position in summer heat and short of supplies. But of course, he'd been able to sail back to New York. In 1780, that was 1778, 1778. There was no equivalent to that in Yorktown. Now, so if you want to be Cornwallis, you can blame the allocation of naval resources, particularly Rodney sending too many warships back from the West Indies to European waters in 81. I think even if the British had been able to withdraw from Yorktown in 81, I still can't see how at that point either side could avoid some kind of compromise. Now, from the Patriot point of view, the marvellous thing was that the North government falls. The government that replaces it, first the government of the Marquis of Rockingham, and then after he dies, the government of the second Earl of Shelburne, later first Marquis of Lansdowne, they each want peace. They each are more prepared. Shelburne was a protege of William Pitt the Elder. Rockingham had been an opposition Whig. They are prepared by temperament to conciliate the Patriots. But also, they quite brilliantly realise that the power that is most likely to rat on its allies are the American Patriots. There is a transactional nature to their alliance with the French. There's a marvellous book by the American scholar Peter Hill on French views of the early republic, which is all full, published by the American Philosophical Society, all full of French complaints about, ingratitude from the part of, on the part of the Patriots. So the British essentially peel off the coalition against them by a series of bilateral peace treaties. And from that point of view, they give the terms to the Patriots that the Patriots want. The Patriots acclaim it as victory, rather as they were to provide a misleading account of the War of 1812. And for the British, there are other things to think about. They have to focus on the French, and indeed, after the war, there is a short-lived attempt under Pitt the Younger for a rapprochement with France in 86-87. Then there's near war in 87, the Dutch crisis. There's near war with France and Spain in 90, the Nuclear crisis, and with Russia in 91, the Ochakov crisis. People have got other things to think about than the Americans. So the end of the war very much works out on Patriot terms, but not in a way that had been forced by Patriot efforts. Looked at differently, what the Patriots had done is shown enormous resolution in keeping going. And that was Washington's triumph, that they just kept going. And by keeping going, and in some areas having driven out the British completely, New England, by doing that, they are able to keep a kernel of an American state going and to put the British in a difficult position. Last point. But having said that, what the American Civil War shows is that will itself is not enough. The Confederacy took, among its white population, white male population, higher casualties in dead and wounded than the Patriots suffered in the American War of Independence. There's no doubt that the Confederates were willing to fight and die, but they still lost. So I think one has to move away from any sense of inevitability. One has to move away from a sense that will determines the outcome. One has to move away from naive ideas about what is and isn't progress and the future and modernity. And the last point, we could replay this by talking about the French Revolutionary Wars. And people could tell you how modern and progressive the French revolutionaries were, column attacks, mobilization of society. Well, as you all know, the two powers that emerge as the major military powers in the early 19th century from the period we're talking about are not the Americans and the French, it's the British and the Russians. Just because you might think yourself on the side of history, whatever that means, it doesn't mean you're going to win. Thank you.